Chapter 1. The Discovery of a Ghost Ship. Welcome to this journey through one of the most perplexing mysteries ever recorded in maritime history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. December 4th, 1872. The North Atlantic Ocean, 400 miles east of the Azores Islands. The temperature was dropping, and Captain David Reed Morehouse stood on the deck of the British brigantine Dei Gratia, watching something that made his blood run cold. Through the gray winter mist, a ship was approaching, but something was terribly, terribly wrong. The vessel moved like a drunk man stumbling through darkness, zigzagging erratically across the water, her sails torn and set at bizarre angles that no competent sailor would ever allow. Captain Morehouse raised his spyglass to his eye, squinting against the salt spray. The deck was empty. No helmsman at the wheel, no crew working the rigging, not a single living soul visible anywhere on board. "Captain," the helmsman called out nervously. "She's been bearing down on us unsteadily for the past hour. About 6 miles off when I first spotted her." Morehouse felt his throat tighten. As the ghost ship drew closer, he could make out her name painted on the bow. His hands trembled slightly as he lowered the spyglass. "My God," he whispered, "that's the Mary Celeste." He knew that ship. More than that, he knew her captain, Benjamin Briggs. They had dined together at New York's Astor House just before their respective departures, sharing stories and whiskey like the old friends they were. Briggs was one of the most experienced and respected sea captains in the merchant fleet. A devout man. A family man. He had brought his young wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia aboard for this voyage to Genoa. 7 skilled crew members completed the ship's complement. 10 souls total. And now, impossibly, the Mary Celeste sailed alone. "Prepare a boarding party," Morehouse ordered, his voice tight with dread. "Something's happened to Captain Briggs and his people." First Mate Oliver DeVoe assembled 2 seamen, and they lowered a small boat into the choppy Atlantic swells. As they rowed toward the silent vessel, an unnatural quiet seemed to swallow them. No human voices, no footsteps, no bell ringing in the wind, just the creaking of wood and the slap of waves against the hull, the sounds of a ship that had become a floating tomb. DeVoe was a practical man, not given to fear or superstition. But as he climbed aboard the Mary Celeste and dropped onto her deck, he felt something he would later struggle to describe to the court in Gibraltar. A wrongness that hung in the air, like invisible smoke. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing across the empty deck. "Anyone aboard?" Silence answered him. A silence so complete it felt alive. The deck was covered with about 3 inches of seawater, sloshing back and forth with the ship's motion. The main hatch stood open, exposing the cargo hold below, something no sailor would ever leave that way in rough seas. Several sails were ripped to shreds, flapping uselessly in the wind like the tattered wings of a dying bird. DeVoe moved toward the ship's wheel. It spun freely, unmanned, controlled only by the push and pull of the Atlantic waves. The compass housing had been smashed, glass scattered across the deck, the instrument itself destroyed. And there, where the ship's lifeboat should have been secured, only empty davits remained, telling the silent story of a desperate abandonment. "Dear God," one of the seamen whispered. "What happened here?" DeVoe descended into the belly of the ship his footsteps echoing in passages that should have been filled with the sounds of sailors at work. What he found in those dark spaces would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the captain's cabin, he discovered chaos, frozen in time. Navigation charts lay scattered across the floor, some damaged by seawater. The ship's sextant, a captain's most precious instrument, was missing. So were most of the ship's official papers. But there, under the bed, lay Captain Briggs's sword, still in its sheath, untouched, unused. Why would a captain abandoning ship leave behind his weapon? What could have frightened him so badly that he didn't even think to arm himself? The crew's quarters told an even more disturbing story. Personal belongings remained exactly where their owners had left them. Clothing hanging from hooks, boots standing in corners, pipes and tobacco pouches sitting on bunks as if waiting for hands that would never return to claim them. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no overturned furniture, no indication whatsoever of violence or panic. It was as if 10 people had simply dissolved into the Atlantic air. In the galley, DeVoe found provisions for 6 months at sea. Fresh water casks stood full. Preserved food lined the shelves in neat rows. But here was something that made his skin crawl. The galley equipment was neatly stowed away, as he would later testify. No food was being prepared, no meal was cooking. Yet in the crew's mess, someone had left a half-eaten breakfast on the table, as if they'd been interrupted mid-bite and never returned. What could interrupt a man's breakfast and make him abandon ship without even finishing his meal? DeVoe descended into the cargo hold, moving carefully between the rows of wooden barrels. The ship carried 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, worth $37,000, equivalent to over $1 million today. Most of them were intact, though 9 appeared to be empty or damaged. If pirates had taken the crew, why leave this fortune behind? If mutiny had occurred, where were the bodies? The most chilling discovery came when DeVoe examined the ship's daily log, found in the mate's cabin. The final entry was dated November 25th at 8 a.m., 9 days earlier. It recorded the Mary Celeste's position as being near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. The entry was routine, mundane, showing absolutely no sign that anything was wrong. But that meant, for 9 full days, this ship had been sailing herself across the Atlantic with no one at the helm. For 9 days, she had navigated through storms and swells, somehow maintaining enough course to travel nearly 400 nautical miles. How was that even possible? DeVoe returned to the deck and stared out at the gray Atlantic horizon. Somewhere out there, perhaps drifting in the ship's missing lifeboat, were the answers. Or perhaps the ocean had already swallowed those answers, along with 10 souls who would never be seen again. He returned to the Dei Gratia to report his findings to Captain Morehouse. The older captain listened in growing horror as DeVoe described the scene. "The ship is seaworthy, Captain," DeVoe concluded. "She's made less water in her bilges than we have. Her cargo is intact, but every single person has vanished." Morehouse made a difficult decision. Under maritime law, he could claim salvage rights to the abandoned vessel, but it would raise terrible questions. Why would his crew happen upon this valuable prize so conveniently? Could they have murdered Briggs and his people? Nevertheless, the Mary Celeste couldn't be left to drift across shipping lanes, endangering other vessels. "We'll sail her to Gibraltar," Morehouse said finally. "Split the crew. You'll take the Mary Celeste with 2 men. God help you all for the next week." DeVoe nodded, but his face had gone pale. 3 men aboard a ghost ship for a week-long voyage across the winter Atlantic, surrounded by the personal effects of 10 missing souls, sleeping in bunks where others had slept before vanishing into nothing. For the next 7 days, the 2 ships sailed in company toward Gibraltar. Aboard the Mary Celeste, Oliver Deveau and his skeleton crew worked to keep her on course. At night, with only the sound of creaking wood and wind through torn sails, one can only imagine what they thought about, what they felt, what they heard, or imagined they heard, in the darkness below deck. On December 13th, when the Rock of Gibraltar finally appeared through the morning mist, all 6 men aboard both ships must have felt relief wash over them. They had made it to safety. But their ordeal was only beginning. Because now came the questions. Impossible questions with no good answers. Questions that would spawn theories ranging from the rational to the absurd. Questions that would create one of the greatest maritime mysteries in history. A mystery that remains unsolved to this very day, more than 150 years later. The ghost ship had been found. But what had happened to her crew? Where were the 10 souls who had simply vanished into the vast expanse of the Atlantic? The Mary Celeste kept her secrets, and the ocean, it seems, keeps them still. Chapter 2. The Last Days of the Mary Celeste. To understand the mystery of the Mary Celeste, we must first understand the man who commanded her, Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs. Because the ghost ship that was found drifting in the Atlantic tells only half the story. The other half begins in New York Harbor, in the autumn of 1872, when everything still seemed perfect. Benjamin Briggs was not your typical sea captain. Born on April 24, 1835 in Wareham, Massachusetts, he came from a distinguished seafaring family. His father, Nathan Briggs, was a respected ship captain, and 4 of his 5 sons followed him to sea. But Benjamin was different. He was known throughout the maritime community as a deeply religious man who read his Bible daily and regularly bore witness to his faith at prayer meetings. Sailors who had served under him described him as firm but fair, competent and cautious, not the kind of man who took unnecessary risks. In 1862, Briggs married his cousin, Sarah Elizabeth Cobb, daughter of Reverend Leander Cobb. Their honeymoon was spent sailing across the Mediterranean aboard his schooner, the Forest King, a romantic voyage that set the tone for their unconventional marriage. Sarah was an educated woman, unusual for her time, and she loved the sea as much as her husband did. Together they had 2 children, Arthur, born in September 1865, and Sophia Matilda, born in October 1870. By 1872, at 37 years old, Captain Briggs had commanded vessels for over a decade without a single serious incident. He was prosperous enough that he and his brother had even considered leaving the sea entirely to purchase a hardware store in New Bedford. But then an opportunity arose that was too good to pass up. James Winchester, a shipping magnate and old friend, offered Briggs part ownership in a merchant brigantine called the Mary Celeste. Briggs bought his share and immediately had the captain's cabin remodeled to accommodate his family. He was planning something special, a transatlantic voyage to Genoa, Italy, with his wife and youngest daughter aboard. It would be both a business venture and a family adventure. 7-year-old Arthur would stay behind with his grandmother at Rose Cottage in Marion, Massachusetts, to continue his schooling. October 20th, 1872. Captain Briggs arrived at Pier 50 on New York's East River to supervise the loading of his cargo, 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol destined for Italy. The substance was denatured ethanol, rendered poisonous for drinking but valuable for industrial purposes. Each barrel was worth substantial money, and the entire shipment was valued at $37,000, a fortune by 1872 standards. Sarah and 2-year-old Sophia joined him a week later. In the bustling chaos of Pier 50, with longshoremen hauling barrels and sailors checking rigging, the captain's family stood out. Sarah, in her long Victorian dress, holding little Sophia's hand, as the child watched the preparations with wide, curious eyes. They attracted attention, as women and children aboard merchant vessels were uncommon. But Briggs had sailed with Sarah before, and he trusted her completely. She was not just a passenger, she was his companion, his partner in this venture. Briggs chose his crew with exceptional care. This wasn't a random collection of dockside drifters. These were professional, experienced sailors whom he had personally selected. First Mate Albert G. Richardson was married to James Winchester's niece and had sailed under Captain Briggs before. He was a known quantity, reliable, and competent. Second Mate Andrew Gilling, about 25 years old, was born in New York but of Danish extraction, young but skilled. The ship's steward, Edward William Head, was newly married and came with a personal recommendation from Winchester himself. The 4 general seamen were all Germans from the Frisian Islands, brothers Volkert and Bos Lorenzen, along with Arian Martens and Gottlieb Gutschall. They had reputations as peaceable and first-class sailors, according to later testimonials. These were not the kind of men who would mutiny or cause trouble. They were professionals. On Sunday, November 3rd, 1872, Captain Briggs wrote a letter to his mother. His words radiated optimism and confidence. "Our vessel is in beautiful trim, and I hope we shall have a fine passage," he wrote. "We seem to have a very good mate and steward, and I hope I shall have a pleasant voyage." He intended to depart on Tuesday, November 5th. Everything was ready. The ship was loaded, the crew assembled, the family settled in their remodeled cabin. The Mary Celeste was, by all accounts, in excellent condition, seaworthy, well-provisioned, and commanded by one of the most capable captains in the merchant fleet. Tuesday morning arrived. On November 5th, 1872, the Mary Celeste cast off from Pier 50 and moved into New York Harbor. But as they entered the harbor, Captain Briggs noticed the weather turning uncertain. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The wind shifted unpredictably. Briggs was too experienced to push his luck, especially with his wife and daughter aboard. He made the prudent decision to anchor just off Staten Island and wait for better conditions. During this delay, Sarah took the opportunity to send one final letter to her mother-in-law at Rose Cottage. We don't know what she wrote in that letter, but we know it was the last communication anyone would ever receive from her. The last words written by a woman who was about to vanish into history. 2 days later, on November 7th, 1872, the weather improved. Captain Briggs gave the order to weigh anchor, and the Mary Celeste began her journey across the Atlantic Ocean. As the brigantine's sails filled with wind and she headed out past Sandy Hook toward the open ocean, no one watching from shore could have imagined what lay ahead. For the next 2 weeks, the Mary Celeste sailed east across the Atlantic, encountering rough weather and challenging conditions. But this was normal for November sailing. Nothing a ship like the Mary Celeste and a captain like Briggs couldn't handle. Somewhere out there in the gray expanse of ocean, the crew went about their daily routines. The watches changed every 4 hours. The rigging needed constant attention. Sails were adjusted to catch the shifting winds. Below deck, in the remodeled captain's cabin, Sarah Briggs cared for little Sophia. Perhaps she read to her daughter from the books they had brought aboard. Perhaps she sang to her as the ship rocked gently through the swells. Captain Briggs would have checked on them between his duties, stealing moments with his family between navigation calculations and weather observations. The ship's log was kept meticulously, as required. Each day, the officer on watch would record the Mary Celeste's position, the weather conditions, and any notable events. These entries paint a picture of a routine transatlantic voyage, challenging at times, but never desperate, never dangerous. Until November 25th, 1872. That morning at 8 a.m., someone, likely First Mate Richardson, made the final entry in the ship's log. The Mary Celeste's position was recorded as being near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. The entry was routine, mundane. There was no indication of any problem. No mention of storms, leaks, or crew issues. Just another ordinary morning at sea. And then, nothing. No more log entries, no more records, no more voices calling across the deck or footsteps echoing below. Somewhere between that final log entry on November 25th and the discovery by the Dei Gratia on December 4th, something happened aboard the Mary Celeste. Something that caused 10 people, an experienced captain, his wife and child, and 7 professional sailors, to abandon a perfectly seaworthy ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But what? What could possibly frighten a man like Benjamin Briggs so badly that he would put his wife and 2-year-old daughter into a small lifeboat in the middle of the ocean? What could be so terrifying that leaving the safety of the ship seemed like the better option? Whatever it was, it happened fast. The crew didn't take their personal belongings. They didn't pack their sea chests. Edward Head left behind his pipe and tobacco, items a sailor would never abandon willingly. The seamen left their clothing, their boots, their most basic possessions. Captain Briggs left behind his sword, still sheathed under his bed. Sarah didn't take the sewing machine she had brought aboard, or Sophia's toys that were found scattered in the cabin. They left behind 6 months of food and water. They left behind a cargo worth a fortune. They left behind everything except, apparently, the ship's sextant and some navigational papers, suggesting that whoever made the decision to abandon ship at least tried to give themselves a chance at survival. The ship they abandoned was damaged but functional. Yes, some sails were torn, but ships sailed with torn sails all the time. Yes, there was water in the hold, but not enough to sink her. One of the pumps had been disassembled, but the ship was in no immediate danger of sinking. So why leave? Why would Benjamin Spooner Briggs, a cautious, experienced, God-fearing captain who had sailed for over a decade without incident, make the decision to put his family and crew into a small lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? What did they see? What did they hear? What did they fear? And most haunting of all, when they pushed off from the Mary Celeste in that small lifeboat, did they watch the ship sail away from them? Did they realize too late that they had made a terrible mistake? Did Sarah hold little Sophia close as the brigantine disappeared into the distance, taking with it their food, their water, their shelter, and their only real chance of survival? Or did something else happen entirely? Something so strange, so inexplicable, that 150 years later we still cannot imagine it. The Mary Celeste kept sailing, unmanned and alone, across the Atlantic. For 9 days, she navigated through storms and swells, somehow maintaining enough course to travel nearly 400 nautical miles without a single person at the helm, as if the ship itself refused to die, as if she was waiting to be found so she could tell her story. But when she was finally discovered by Captain Morehouse and his crew, the Mary Celeste could only show them what had happened, not explain why. And that why has become one of history's greatest mysteries. Chapter 3. Strange Clues on Board. When the Mary Celeste and the Dei Gratia finally reached Gibraltar on December 13, 1872, Captain Morehouse expected a straightforward salvage claim hearing. He had done the right thing, rescued an abandoned vessel, saved valuable cargo, brought her safely to port. Under maritime law, he and his crew were entitled to compensation. It should have been a formality. Instead, what awaited them was suspicion, accusations, and an investigation that would raise more questions than it answered. The British Vice Admiralty Court appointed Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar, to conduct the salvage hearing. Flood was a man of rigid thinking and deep suspicion. When he boarded the Mary Celeste for his initial inspection, he didn't see a maritime mystery. He saw a crime scene. And in his mind, the most likely criminals were standing right in front of him: Captain Morehouse and the crew of the Dei Gratia. The state of the vessel, Flood wrote in his official report, creates uncomfortable doubts as to the character of the seamen who navigated her. His theory was simple: conspiracy. Perhaps Morehouse and Briggs had plotted together to stage an abandonment, split the salvage money, and start new lives. Or perhaps Morehouse's crew had committed piracy on the high seas, murdered everyone aboard the Mary Celeste, and concocted the story of finding her abandoned. The fact that Morehouse and Briggs had dined together before their departures only strengthened his suspicions. But theories require evidence. And so Flood ordered a meticulous examination of the Mary Celeste, searching for proof of foul play. What his investigators found aboard that ship created a puzzle that has baffled experts for over 150 years, not because the clues didn't exist, but because they contradicted each other in impossible ways. Let's walk through the ship as the investigators did, examining each strange detail, each inexplicable clue that made this mystery so maddeningly unsolvable. The deck. On the main deck, the first obvious clue was the missing lifeboat. The davits, the mechanical arms used to lower and raise the boat, hung empty. This suggested a deliberate abandonment rather than a sudden disaster that swept everyone overboard. People had made the conscious decision to leave the ship. But why? The deck itself offered no clear answers. There was water, about 3 inches of it sloshing around, but this was normal for a ship that had been sailing unmanned for days. Several sails were torn or in disarray, but again, this could have happened during the 9 days the ship sailed itself, or in the rough weather that was recorded in the ship's log. The most perplexing detail was the ship's binnacle, the compass housing. It had been smashed, the glass shattered, the compass itself damaged. This was not normal wear and tear. Something violent had happened here. But what? A heavy wave crashing over the deck? Someone deliberately destroying the navigation equipment in panic? Or something else entirely? The captain's cabin. Captain Briggs's personal quarters told a story of sudden disruption. Navigation charts were scattered across the floor, some damaged by water. The ship's sextant, a captain's most essential navigation tool, was missing, along with most of the ship's official papers. Only the ship's logbook remained, and even that final entry on November 25th revealed nothing unusual. under the bed, investigators found Captain Briggs's sword still in its sheath. This single detail spoke volumes. Why would a captain abandoning his ship, especially if he feared pirates, mutiny, or any human threat, leave behind his only weapon? The sword hadn't been drawn, hadn't been used. It had simply been left behind, as if weapons were irrelevant to whatever had frightened them. Frederick Solly Flood examined this sword carefully and made a dramatic announcement. He had found blood on the blade. This, he declared, was proof of violence, perhaps mutiny, perhaps murder. He ordered further testing. The results must have disappointed him. It wasn't blood. It was rust. The sword had been exposed to salt air and moisture, nothing more sinister. But Flood's initial announcement had already been reported in newspapers, and the story of the bloody sword became part of the Mary Celeste legend, persisting even after it was proven false. Sarah Briggs's belongings remained in the cabin, her clothing, her personal items, even her jewelry box. Sophia's toys lay scattered where a 2-year-old had left them. The family had taken nothing, except, presumably, whatever they could carry in their arms as they rushed to abandon ship. The crew's quarters below deck, in the cramped spaces where the 7 sailors had lived, the scene was equally perplexing. Personal belongings remained exactly where their owners had left them. Boots stood in corners. Pipes and tobacco pouches sat on bunks. Clothing hung from hooks. Sea chests remained unopened. These were not wealthy men. Everything they owned in the world was aboard this ship. Yet they had abandoned it all without a second thought. Whatever had frightened them, it had been immediate and overwhelming enough to override every human instinct to grab your possessions before fleeing. There were no signs of struggle in the crew's quarters, no overturned furniture, no blood, no indication of violence or panic. The spaces looked as if the men had simply stepped out for their watch duty and never returned. The galley. Perhaps the most haunting details were found in the ship's kitchen. The galley equipment was neatly stowed, as Oliver DeVoe had noted in his testimony. But nearby, someone had left a half-eaten meal on a table. A knife and fork lay beside a plate, as if the person eating had been interrupted mid-bite. The stove was cold, no fire had been lit recently, but food stores were abundant. 6 months of provisions filled the shelves. Casks of fresh water stood ready for use. There was no reason for the crew to abandon ship due to shortage of food or water. What kind of emergency interrupts a man's breakfast, but leaves him no time to even finish his meal? The cargo hold. In the belly of the ship lay 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, worth $37,000, a fortune in 1872. Most of the barrels were intact, but here was another mysterious clue. 9 of the barrels were found empty or damaged. This detail would later become crucial to understanding what might have happened. Industrial alcohol, denatured ethanol, produces invisible, flammable vapors. In the enclosed space of a ship's hold, especially in rough weather when ventilation hatches had to be sealed shut, these vapors could accumulate. Investigators also discovered that one of the ship's 2 pumps had been disassembled. Why would someone take apart a pump in the middle of the ocean? The most logical explanation: Captain Briggs wanted to measure how much water was in the hold. Perhaps he feared the ship was taking on water faster than normal. There was indeed water in the hold, about 3.5 feet of it, sloshing around the bottom of the ship. But this was not a dangerous amount. Ships routinely carried this much water in their bilges. The Mary Celeste was in no immediate danger of sinking. So why had Captain Briggs disassembled the pump? What had worried him enough to check the water level so urgently? The ship's rigging on deck? Investigators examined the condition of the ship's rigging and sails. Some were damaged, torn by weather and wind, but one detail stood out. A rope had been found trailing in the water behind the ship. A long rope, as if it had been tied to something that was no longer there. Had this rope been attached to the lifeboat? Some theorized that Captain Briggs, fearing his ship was in immediate danger but not wanting to lose contact with her, had tied the lifeboat to the Mary Celeste with this long rope. Perhaps he intended to wait at a safe distance until the perceived danger passed, then return to the ship. If this theory was true, it painted a heartbreaking picture. The lifeboat, tied behind the Mary Celeste by a single rope, being towed through rough Atlantic seas, and then the rope breaking. The lifeboat drifting away as the Mary Celeste sailed on, carrying with her all the food, water, and shelter that 10 people desperately needed. Did Captain Briggs watch helplessly as his ship disappeared into the distance, taking with her any hope of survival? The timeline mystery. One of the most puzzling clues was the timeline itself. The last log entry was November 25th at 8 a.m., placing the Mary Celeste near Santa Maria Island. When the Dei Gratia found her on December 4th, she was 400 miles away from that position. This meant the Mary Celeste had sailed herself, completely unmanned, for at least 9 days, through rough weather, through storms, through seas that should have sent her off course or capsized her. Yet somehow, she had maintained enough directional stability to travel 400 nautical miles. How was this even possible? Ships don't steer themselves. They don't maintain course through Atlantic weather without a crew adjusting sails, working the wheel, making constant corrections. Yet the Mary Celeste had done exactly that, as if guided by invisible hands. The conclusion: that wasn't. After 3 months of investigation, Frederick Solly Flood had to admit defeat. He had found no evidence of piracy, no proof of mutiny, no indication of murder or foul play. Despite his initial suspicions about Captain Morehouse and the Dei Gratia crew, he had to acknowledge that they had simply stumbled upon an abandoned ship. The court eventually awarded them salvage rights, though the payment was insultingly small. Only 1/6 of the $46,000 they had requested. The implication was clear. The authorities still suspected something improper, even if they couldn't prove it. But suspicion is not evidence, and evidence in the case of the Mary Celeste only deepened the mystery. Every clue found aboard the ship raised more questions than it answered. The sword that wasn't bloody, the compass that was inexplicably smashed, the pump that had been disassembled, the rope trailing in the water, the half-eaten meal in the galley, the 9 empty alcohol barrels. Each detail, examined individually, seemed to suggest a rational explanation. But taken together, they formed a pattern that made no sense. A puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit, no matter how you arranged them. The Mary Celeste had been found. She had been thoroughly examined. Every inch of her had been documented and investigated by British authorities. And yet, she kept her secrets. What had happened aboard that ship on November 25th, 1872, remained as mysterious as ever. The physical evidence could tell investigators what the crew had left behind, but it couldn't explain why they had left. It couldn't reveal what they had seen, what they had feared, what had driven them to make the fatal decision to abandon a perfectly seaworthy ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. For that, we would need to turn to theories. speculation based on the strange clues found aboard. And those theories, as we'll discover, range from the scientifically plausible to the utterly impossible. Chapter 4. Theories of Disappearance. The Mary Celeste mystery created something unprecedented in maritime history. A void so complete, so inexplicable, that it invited the entire world to fill it with theories. From the moment the story broke in newspapers across Europe and America, everyone from experienced sea captains to amateur detectives to sensationalist writers offered their explanations for what happened on November 25th, 1872. Some of these theories were scientific and plausible. Others were fantastical, even absurd. But each one attempted to answer the same impossible question. What could frighten 10 people so badly that abandoning a perfectly seaworthy ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean seemed like their best chance of survival? Let's examine the most compelling theories and discover why, even after 150 years of investigation, none of them fully explains what happened aboard that ghost ship. The alcohol vapor explosion theory. This is perhaps the most scientifically credible explanation, and it starts with those 9 empty or damaged barrels in the cargo hold. The Mary Celeste carried 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, denatured ethanol that was poisonous to drink but highly flammable. Records show that approximately 300 gallons of this alcohol had leaked from the damaged barrels. In the enclosed space of the ship's hold, especially during rough weather, when ventilation hatches would be sealed shut, these fumes would accumulate into a volatile, invisible cloud. Alcohol vapor is extremely flammable. Even a tiny spark, from 2 barrels rubbing together in rough seas, or from a careless crew member opening a hatch with his pipe still lit, could trigger a massive explosion. But here's the fascinating part. Ethanol burns at a very low temperature. Its explosion is violent and terrifying, but it burns out almost instantly and leaves no scorch marks on wood. In 2005, Dr. Andrea Sella from University College London tested this theory by building a scale replica of the Mary Celeste's cargo hold. He filled it with butane gas to simulate the alcohol vapor, then ignited it. The result was dramatic. A massive ball of flame shot up through the hold, powerful enough to blow off the main hatch. Yet when the fire burned out seconds later, the wooden structure showed no burn marks whatsoever. Imagine you're Captain Briggs, standing on deck on November 25th. Suddenly, a violent explosion rocks the ship. Flames shoot up from the cargo hold, engulfing the deck in terrifying heat. The main hatch is blown open. Your wife screams. Your 2-year-old daughter cries in terror. Every sailor's instinct tells you the same thing. The ship is about to explode again, or the fire will spread, or the cargo will ignite in a chain reaction that will turn the Mary Celeste into a floating inferno. You have seconds to make a decision. You order everyone into the lifeboat immediately. Perhaps you tie a long rope from the lifeboat to the ship. You don't want to lose your vessel completely. You'll wait at a safe distance. Watch to see if there's a second explosion. If the ship doesn't sink or burn, you can return to her in an hour or 2. But there is no second explosion. The alcohol vapor has burned off harmlessly, leaving no trace. The Mary Celeste is perfectly safe. But you're in a lifeboat 100 feet behind the ship, and suddenly a large swell hits. The rope snaps. The Mary Celeste's sails catch the wind, and she begins to pull away. You row desperately, trying to catch her. But a small lifeboat with 10 people aboard, including a woman and a 2-year-old child, cannot keep pace with a full-rigged brigantine under sail. You watch helplessly as your ship disappears over the horizon, taking with her all the food, water, and shelter you need to survive. It's a heartbreaking theory, and it explains almost everything. The missing lifeboat, the blown-open hatch, the rope trailing in the water, the absence of burn marks, the crew's decision to abandon ship in such desperate haste. But does it explain everything? The seaquake and waterspout theory. Some historians believe the alcohol explosion wasn't the primary cause. It was a secondary effect triggered by something even more violent, a seaquake. A seaquake is an underwater earthquake that sends shock waves through the ocean. Ships caught in seaquakes report feeling massive jolts, as if the vessel has struck a submerged rock at full speed. Loose cargo flies through the air. Equipment breaks free from moorings. Crew members are thrown off their feet. And most terrifying of all, it feels exactly like the ship has struck something and is about to sink. Remember that disassembled pump in the Mary Celeste's hold? Captain Briggs had been checking the water level, concerned that his ship was taking on too much water. What if a seaquake had jolted the ship so violently that Briggs became convinced she had been damaged below the waterline? What if he believed she was sinking? A seaquake could also explain the damaged rigging, the smashed compass, the galley equipment knocked loose. And if the shock wave caused those 9 barrels of alcohol to rupture, the escaping fumes could have been ignited by the galley stove breaking free, creating the explosion that sent everyone fleeing to the lifeboat. Alternatively, or additionally, a waterspout may have struck the Mary Celeste. These towering columns of rotating air and water are one of the most feared phenomena in maritime history. Waterspouts generate extremely low barometric pressure at their base, powerful enough to suck water from a ship's bilge up through the pumps. If a waterspout had passed close to the Mary Celeste, it could have done something terrifying. It could have made Captain Briggs believe his ship was rapidly filling with water, when in reality the water he saw rushing through the pumps was being drawn up from the bilge by the pressure difference. Think about it from Briggs's perspective. You've just felt a massive jolt that threw everyone off balance. Your compass is smashed. Water is suddenly gushing through the pumps at an alarming rate. You disassemble the sounding pump to check the water level, and it confirms your worst fear. There's 3.5 feet of water in the hold. The ship feels unstable. Your wife and daughter are in danger. Every instinct tells you, abandon ship now, before she goes down. So you do. And only later, too late, do you realize the water level was normal, the ship was never in danger, and you've condemned 10 people to death in a small lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic. The piracy and mutiny theory. This was Attorney General Frederick Solly Flood's favorite theory, though he could never prove it. He suggested 2 possibilities. Either the Day Grace's crew had committed piracy, murdering everyone aboard the Mary Celeste before staging the Discovery, or the Mary Celeste's own crew had mutinied, killed Captain Briggs and his family, then fled in the lifeboat. But both theories have fatal flaws. If piracy had occurred, where were the bodies? Why was the valuable cargo left untouched? Why were personal belongings not looted? And why would pirates abandon a perfectly functional ship worth thousands of dollars? The mutiny theory is even less plausible. Captain Briggs had personally selected his crew. They were experienced, professional sailors with good reputations, peaceable and first class. according to their references. More importantly, there was no evidence of violence anywhere on the ship. No blood, no signs of struggle, no bodies. And why would mutineers take a 2-year-old child with them in the lifeboat? The poisoning theory. Some theorists have suggested that the crew's food or water supply became contaminated, causing mass hallucinations or insanity. Ergot poisoning from contaminated grain can cause violent delusions. Perhaps someone aboard went mad and convinced the others that the ship was haunted, or sinking, or otherwise doomed. But this theory requires too many coincidences. All 10 people would have had to be affected simultaneously. Yet the ship's log entries remained rational and clear right up until November 25th. There's no evidence of erratic behavior, no indication that Captain Briggs, a careful, experienced commander, had any concerns about his crew's mental state. The giant squid theory. Yes, this theory actually exists, popular in the late 1800s when giant squid were still considered mythical creatures. The idea was that a massive sea creature attacked the ship, tentacles reaching up to grab crew members from the deck, forcing the survivors to flee in the lifeboat. It's dramatic. It's terrifying. It's also completely implausible. Giant squid exist, but they live in deep water and have never been documented attacking ships. More importantly, there would have been evidence: torn rigging, sucker marks on the deck, signs of struggle. The Mary Celeste showed none of these things. The truth, we'll never know. The alcohol vapor explosion theory, possibly triggered by a seaquake or waterspout, remains the most scientifically credible explanation. It accounts for nearly all the physical evidence: the blown open hatch, the missing lifeboat, the crew's desperate haste, the lack of burn marks, the trailing rope, the disassembled pump. But even this theory cannot answer every question. Why didn't Captain Briggs wait to see if there was a second explosion before abandoning ship? Why didn't they take even basic supplies for the lifeboat? How did the Mary Celeste maintain course for 9 days without anyone at the helm? And most haunting of all, if they did abandon ship in panic, what were Benjamin Briggs's final thoughts as he watched the Mary Celeste sail away, carrying with her any hope of survival? Did he hold Sarah and little Sophia close as the Atlantic waves grew higher around their small lifeboat? Did he pray for rescue that would never come? We'll never know. The Atlantic Ocean swallowed those answers 150 years ago, along with 10 souls whose fate remains one of history's greatest mysteries. The theories give us possibilities, but the Mary Celeste and the sea keep their secrets still. Chapter 5. The ship's fate and the enduring legacy. The Mary Celeste survived her ordeal. The 10 people who abandoned her did not. After 3 months of investigation, hearings, and suspicion in Gibraltar, the British Vice Admiralty Court finally released the Mary Celeste from legal custody in March 1873. Captain Morehouse and his crew received their salvage payment, though it was insultingly small, just 1/6 of what they had requested, reflecting the lingering suspicion that somehow they had been involved in foul play. The ship herself was turned over to James Winchester, the primary owner, who had lost not just his investment, but also his business partner and friend, Captain Benjamin Briggs. Winchester faced a dilemma. The Mary Celeste was perfectly functional, worth thousands of dollars, and capable of continuing in merchant service. But she was also cursed, or at least that's what every sailor from New York to Genoa believed. Who would want to crew a ship where 10 people had vanished without explanation? What captain would risk his life and the lives of his men aboard a vessel that might be haunted by the spirits of Sarah Briggs and her 2-year-old daughter. Nevertheless, commerce demanded practicality. Winchester refitted the ship, found a new captain willing to take the risk, and put the Mary Celeste back into service. For the next 12 years, she sailed the Atlantic and Mediterranean routes, carrying cargo between American and European ports. She changed hands several times, passing through a succession of owners, each one apparently willing to overlook the ship's dark history in exchange for a good deal on a functional brigantine. But the curse, if there was one, never truly left her. The final voyage. By 1884, the Mary Celeste had fallen into disrepair and disrepute. She was old, worn down by years of hard use, and her reputation as an unlucky ship had driven down her value significantly. She ended up in the hands of a consortium of Boston shippers who saw not a vessel, but an opportunity. Captain Gilman C. Parker took command in November 1884. On paper, the ship was loaded with a valuable cargo: boots, fish, herring, cat food, ale, and other miscellaneous goods, insured for $30,000. In reality, the cargo was mostly worthless junk: old boots, rotten fish, barrels of water masquerading as valuable goods. It was a classic insurance fraud scheme, and Parker was in on it from the beginning. On January 3, 1885, Captain Parker deliberately sailed the Mary Celeste onto a coral reef called Rochelet Bank near the coast of Haiti. His plan was simple: wreck the ship, claim it was an accident, collect the insurance money, and split it with his Boston partners. The reef would destroy the evidence of the worthless cargo, and everyone would walk away rich. But the Mary Celeste, which had survived abandonment, Atlantic storms, and 12 years of hard sailing, refused to die quietly. The ship struck the reef and stuck fast, but she didn't sink. She didn't break apart. She just sat there on the coral, her hull damaged but intact, stubbornly refusing to slip beneath the waves and take Parker's fraud with her. The captain and crew had to abandon her, ironically becoming the second group of people to flee the Mary Celeste and row to shore in boats. When the insurance company sent investigators to examine the wreck, they quickly discovered the truth. The cargo was worthless. The wrecking was deliberate. The entire scheme fell apart. Parker and his conspirators were arrested and charged with barratry, the criminal act of deliberately destroying a ship to defraud insurers. The trial became a sensation. Here was the famous ghost ship, the Mary Celeste, which had already captured public imagination with its mysterious abandonment, now at the center of another scandal. But fate had one more twist in store. Before the trial could conclude, several of the defendants died under mysterious circumstances. Captain Parker himself died within 3 months of the wrecking. The Boston shippers involved in the scheme also died or faced financial ruin shortly afterward. Some said it was coincidence. Others whispered that the Mary Celeste had finally claimed her revenge, that the ship, which had been cursed since that fateful day in November 1872, had brought doom upon those who tried to use her for fraud. The Mary Celeste herself was left to rot on Rochelet Bank. No one attempted to salvage her. She was beyond repair, and more importantly, no one wanted to touch her. The ghost ship slowly deteriorated under the Caribbean sun and tropical storms, her timbers bleaching white, her masts falling, her deck collapsing. By the time the 20th century arrived, nothing remained but scattered pieces of wood and metal on a Haitian reef, the physical remains of a ship that had become far more famous for what happened aboard her than for anything she had carried in her hold. The birth of a legend. The Mary Celeste might have faded into obscurity, just another merchant ship that met an ignominious end on a coral reef, except for one thing: Arthur Conan Doyle. In 1883, a young 24-year-old doctor named Arthur Conan Doyle, not yet famous, years away from creating Sherlock Holmes, read about the Mary Celeste mystery and became fascinated. He was living on the Sussex coast, supplementing his meager medical practice income by writing short stories for magazines. The tale of the abandoned brigantine fired his imagination. Doyle sat down and wrote a short story titled J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement. It was presented as a first-person account by a survivor of the abandoned ship, which Doyle renamed the Mary Celeste. Note the different spelling. In his fictional version, the ship was taken over by a vengeful former slave who murdered most of the crew and passengers in a plot involving a mystical stone and revenge against slavers. The story appeared in the January 1884 issue of the Cornhill magazine, and it caused an immediate sensation. Doyle had written it in such a convincing documentary style, the same technique he would later use for the Sherlock Holmes stories, that many readers believed it was a genuine first-hand account of real events. The Boston Herald even reprinted it as a news item, treating it as factual reporting. When the truth emerged that it was fiction, the controversy only amplified interest in the story. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what really happened aboard the Mary Celeste. Doyle's story, while completely invented, had brought the mystery to worldwide attention. And in the process, Doyle accidentally created something that would plague historians for the next 140 years. He mixed his fictional embellishments with the real facts so thoroughly that people could no longer distinguish between what had actually happened and what he had made up. His story included details like a half-eaten meal still warm on the table, which never actually existed aboard the real Mary Celeste, but became part of the legend anyway. Over the following decades, the Mary Celeste story was retold, republished, and embellished countless times. Each retelling added new details, new theories, new dramatic flourishes. The half-eaten breakfast became a hot cup of coffee still steaming on the captain's table. The crew's personal effects became carefully laid-out clothing, as if people had simply vanished while getting dressed. The ship's cat, which never existed, became a recurring character in many versions, found alive and well aboard the abandoned vessel. By the early 20th century, the Mary Celeste had transcended history and entered the realm of legend. Cultural impact and enduring mystery. The Mary Celeste has become more than a historical event. She has become a cultural archetype, the template for every ghost ship story that followed. The story has inspired hundreds of books, from serious historical investigations to pulp fiction novels. It has been the subject of countless documentaries, each one presenting the definitive explanation for what happened, only to be contradicted by the next documentary. The ship has appeared in films ranging from The Mystery of the Mary Celeste, 1935, starring Bela Lugosi, to modern productions like Haunting of the Mary Celeste, 2020. Television shows from The Twilight Zone to Doctor Who have featured episodes based on the Mary Celeste. The ship has been referenced in songs, comic books, video games, and even in casual conversation. When someone says a place looks like the Mary Celeste, everyone knows they mean it's abandoned and eerie, with signs of recent habitation, but no people present. Why has this particular maritime mystery captured imagination so completely? There have been other ship disappearances, other unsolved maritime mysteries, but none have achieved the cultural penetration of the Mary Celeste. Perhaps it's because the mystery is so complete. With most disappearances, some evidence exists, wreckage is found, bodies are recovered, witnesses report storms or problems. But the Mary Celeste offers nothing. The ship was found intact, the crew simply gone, the evidence contradictory and confusing. It's a void into which human imagination can pour endless theories and possibilities. Perhaps it's because the story contains such human elements. Not just anonymous sailors, but a captain with his wife and 2-year-old daughter aboard. We can imagine Sarah Briggs's terror as she clutched little Sophia. We can picture Captain Benjamin Briggs' anguished face as he made the fatal decision to abandon ship. The tragedy isn't abstract, it's deeply, heartbreakingly human. Or perhaps it's because, despite 150 years of investigation, scientific testing, and historical research, we still don't know what happened. In an age when DNA analysis can solve cold cases decades old, when satellites track every ship on the ocean, when technology seems capable of answering every question, the Mary Celeste remains stubbornly unexplained. The search for closure families of the missing never found closure. Benjamin Briggs's mother, Sophia, lived the rest of her life hoping for news of her son, her daughter-in-law, and her granddaughter. Arthur Briggs, the 7-year-old boy who had stayed behind at Rose Cottage, grew up without his parents or sister, haunted by the knowledge that they had simply vanished from the world without explanation. James Winchester, who had lost his friend and business partner, spent years trying to understand what had happened. He commissioned his own investigations, interviewed every expert he could find, but never found answers that satisfied him. The families of the 7 crew members, the 2 mates, the steward, and the 4 German sailors, faced similar uncertainty. Were their loved ones dead? Almost certainly. But where? How? When? Did they suffer? Did they have any hope of rescue? Or did they know immediately that abandoning the ship was a death sentence? These questions haunted survivors and descendants for generations. Even today, descendants of the Briggs family occasionally contact maritime historians, still hoping that some new evidence might emerge, some forgotten document might surface, that finally explains what happened on November 25th, 1872. Modern investigations. In the 21st century, technology has allowed for new investigations into the Mary Celeste mystery. In 2005, Dr. Andrea Sella's experiment at University College London demonstrated that an alcohol vapor explosion could have occurred without leaving burn marks, providing the first scientifically credible explanation for why the crew might have abandoned ship in panic. In 2007, marine historians Anne McGregor and Valerie Richardson used advanced weather data and navigation analysis to track the Mary Celeste's likely course in those final days. They discovered that Captain Briggs was probably 120 miles west of where he thought he was, likely due to an inaccurate chronometer. This meant he should have sighted land 3 days earlier than he did, a discrepancy that might have caused him great anxiety about his position and the ship's safety. These modern investigations have provided plausible explanations, but they haven't provided proof. We can theorize. We can test hypotheses. We can demonstrate what might have happened. But we can never know with certainty what Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs saw, heard, or feared on that November morning in 1872 that caused him to make the fatal decision to abandon his ship, the Mary Celeste. Today, no physical trace of the Mary Celeste remains. The ship rotted away on that Haitian reef over a century ago. But her legacy endures in unexpected ways. Maritime insurance companies still study the case as an example of how difficult it is to determine what happened aboard a ship when the crew cannot testify. The Mary Celeste salvage hearings in Gibraltar set legal precedents about burden of proof that are still referenced in Admiralty law today. The story is taught in maritime academies as a cautionary tale about decision-making under pressure. What would you have done in Captain Briggs's position? If you believed your ship was in danger, whether from explosion, seaquake, or taking on water, would you risk your family's lives by staying aboard? Or would you risk them by launching a small lifeboat into the Atlantic? The Mary Celeste has also become a touchstone for discussions about how legends form and spread. The way Arthur Conan Doyle's fictional details became accepted as fact demonstrates how easily misinformation can corrupt historical understanding. Modern historians studying the case spend as much time debunking myths as they do investigating actual evidence. And perhaps most importantly, the Mary Celeste reminds us that despite all our technology, all our scientific advancement, all our certainty that we've explained the world, some mysteries remain unsolved. Some questions have no answers. Some secrets stay hidden forever. The eternal question. On November 25th, 1872, at approximately 8 a.m., someone aboard the Mary Celeste, probably First Mate Albert Richardson, made the final entry in the ship's log. It was routine, unremarkable, showing the ship's position near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. And then something happened. What was it? Did Captain Briggs see flames shooting from the cargo hold and believe his ship was about to explode? Did a seaquake jolt the vessel so violently that he thought she had been fatally damaged? Did a waterspout create such a pressure differential that water gushed through the pumps, convincing him the ship was sinking? Did some combination of these factors, happening in rapid succession, create a cascade of panic that led to the fatal decision to abandon ship? Or did something else happen entirely? Something we haven't even considered? Something outside our current understanding of maritime disasters? We'll never know. The Atlantic Ocean swallowed the answer, along with 10 souls whose names are recorded in history, but whose final moments remain forever mysterious. The Mary Celeste was just a ship, wood and canvas and rope, built to carry cargo across oceans. She was neither lucky nor unlucky, neither cursed nor blessed. She was a tool, operated by human beings, who made the best decisions they could with the information they had. But because of what happened aboard her on one November day in 1872, the Mary Celeste has become immortal. Long after the last piece of her timbers dissolved into Caribbean waters, her name lives on. A byword for mystery, a symbol of the unexplained, a reminder that even in our modern age, some questions remain forever unanswered. The ghost ship has been gone for over a century, but her mystery sails on, eternal as the sea itself.